I always believed I was the one born to struggle, the one who just wasn't as good as my brother. My name is Laurel Adams. I live paycheck to paycheck, proud of my self-reliance. But at a stiff birthday dinner in a home where appearances are everything, one question shattered my entire reality. My aunt asked, "Laurel, how have you been using the trust fund?" A trust fund. I was working 2 jobs just to pay rent. Suddenly I realized my whole life, every struggle, every failure, it wasn't bad luck, it was a lie. What do you do when the people you trust are the ones who stole your future? Like, share, comment, and subscribe to our channel. We always appreciate the time you spent here with us. I've always believed that some people are just born with a safety net stretched tight beneath them, and some of us are born learning how to fall. At 28, I was a professional faller. My name is Laurel Adams. I live in Portland, where I work as a graphic designer for a firm that pays me just enough to pretend I'm building a career, and I supplement that by bartending on weekends. I live paycheck to paycheck, a reality that hums under my skin like a constant low-grade fever. But it's my life. I chose it. I value my freedom, the quiet satisfaction of knowing that every bill I pay, every meal I eat, I earned myself. Self-reliance isn't just a preference for me. It's the only religion I've ever known. My family wasn't the kind you leaned on. At least I wasn't. My relationship with my parents, Marianne and Russell Adams, and my older brother Caleb is like a room in our house I just stopped going into. It's been years. We're not estranged, not officially, we just aren't close, aren't. We exist in polite, sterile orbits. Caleb has always been the sun in their solar system. He's charismatic, emotionally exhausting, and perpetually in crisis. He's the one they rescue. He's the one who needs them. His failures, and there were many, were always framed as stepping stones, proof of his daring. My struggles, by contrast, were quiet, private, and treated as evidence that I simply had less potential. I learned early that my independence wasn't just valued, it was required. While Caleb's missteps were cushioned, my achievements were met with a mild, distracted approval, as if I'd simply done what was expected. So when my 28th birthday rolled around, the last thing I wanted to do was drive 2 hours back to my hometown, a small Washington community, where reputation is currency and appearances are everything. But Marianne had insisted. "We're having a proper dinner, Laurel. Just the family." A proper dinner. In my family, that was code for stiff, polite, and suffocating. It was an evening of performance art. The dining room was exactly as I remembered: heavy mahogany silverware that only came out for judgment, and a silence so thick you could cut it with a steak knife. My upbringing wasn't loud or abusive. It was formal. It was cold. It was the feeling of constantly being assessed and found wanting. We talked about the weather. We talked about my father's community group. We talked about Caleb's newest venture, which sounded suspiciously like another pyramid scheme. I kept my answers short, a strategy I'd perfected. Yes, Portland is fine. Yes, work is fine. No, I'm not seeing anyone. The clinking of forks against my mother's best china was the loudest thing in the room. We were just finishing the dry-aged roast, my father's idea of a celebration, when the doorbell rang. My mother froze, a flicker of panic in her eyes. A disruption, an unscripted element. My father sighed, dabbing his mouth with a napkin. "Are we expecting someone, Marianne?" Before she could answer, the dining room door swung open and there she was. Aunt Diane. My mother's estranged sister. Diane was the family whirlwind, the black sheep, the one who had escaped this town and never looked back. She looked incredible, all colorful scarves and loud jewelry, a vibrant splash of life in our beige, muted world. My mother's face went pale. Diane, what are you doing here? It's my niece's birthday, Marianne. Did you think I'd forget? Diane beamed at me, ignoring my parents' rigid postures, and pulled up a chair as if she'd been invited. The tension in the room ratcheted up, vibrating at a pitch only I seemed to enjoy. My parents exchanged a look I knew well. It was the "we'll deal with this later" look, the maintain appearances look. Dessert was served, a store-bought cake, because baking was too personal, too warm. Caleb, who had been texting under the table, finally looked up, flashing Diane his $1,000,000 smile, the one he used when he wanted something. But Diane wasn't looking at him. She was looking at me, a strange, appraising expression on her face. "You know, Laurel," she said, her voice cutting through the polite stiffness, "you look so much like Dad." She was talking about our grandfather. A Wawoo vet, a small business owner, a man I barely remembered but who Diane worshipped. He believed in hard work and legacy. "He would have been so proud of you," Diane continued, "making your own way, especially since you never touched the money." I set my fork down. The air crackled. "What money?" My mother cleared her throat. "Diane, this is hardly the time." "Oh, cut the crap, Marianne." Diane waved her hand dismissively, her bracelets jangling. She turned back to me, her gaze sharpening, suddenly confused. The whole room went still. "Laurel, how have you been using the trust fund Dad set up for you?" I just stared at her. The words didn't compute. Trust fund. Me. It felt like she was speaking a foreign language. I could feel my parents watching me, could feel the sudden intense weight of their combined gaze. I saw it then, a flicker between them. A glance so fast I would have missed it if I hadn't been studying them my whole life. It was practiced. It was terrified. And it was without a doubt rehearsed. My heart, which had been beating in the slow, bored rhythm of the dinner, suddenly kicked hard against my ribs. I managed to find my voice, but it came out as barely a whisper lost in the heavy silence. "What trust fund?" Across the table, my father's fork slipped from his grasp, clattering against the plate with a sound that felt as loud as a gunshot. The rest of the dinner was a blur of fractured silence and thinly veiled panic. My question, "What trust fund?" hung in the air unanswered, while my mother scrambled to regain her composure, blaming Diane's flair for the dramatic. I escaped as soon as I could, ignoring my parents' strained goodbyes. Diane caught me at my car, her face grim in the moonlight. "Don't go back to Portland tonight," she said, her voice low. "Meet me at the diner, 8 a.m., and bring any paperwork you have from Dad." I nodded, my mind too numb to process anything but the order. The next morning I sat across from her in a worn vinyl booth, clutching a thin file of letters from my grandfather I'd kept for sentimental reasons. Diane, unlike my parents, was all facts. She explained that our grandfather, a Wawadipu veteran who had built a successful small business empire from nothing, was a man who believed deeply in two things: rewarding hard work and protecting his family's legacy. "He didn't trust your mother's judgment, Laurel," Diane said, stirring her black coffee. "And he despised how Russell let her coddle Caleb. He wanted to make sure you were protected, that you had a choice." She slid a thick, leather-bound document across the table. "He set up 2 trust funds. They were to be managed by Russell and Marianne as trustees, but only until each of you turned 21. At that point, the funds matured, and control was supposed to pass to you entirely." My breath hitched. 2 funds. One for Caleb," she said, tapping the page. $500,000. Enough for a start, Dad figured. A reward. She then slid her finger down to the second entry. "And one for you, Laurel. $2.5 million. I choked on my coffee, the hot liquid scalding my throat. $2.5 million, Diane, that's impossible. I would know." "Exactly," she said, her eyes hard. "Caleb received his full distribution on his 21st birthday, right on schedule. I always just assumed, I thought you'd gotten yours, and being you had quietly invested it or saved it. I thought you were just choosing to live modestly. I respected you for it." She opened her briefcase and pulled out another file, official distribution logs from the estate. She spread them on the table. "I pulled these last night after I left. I smelled a rat the second I saw your face. She pointed to Caleb's name, showing a clear transfer. Then she moved to the section where my distribution should have been. It was blank. My name wasn't just missing, it was gone as if it had never existed. Diane, what does this mean? It means, she said, her voice dropping to a furious whisper, that your fund was never distributed to you. But I have a sinking feeling it was distributed. Your parents were the only ones with access until you turned 21. I smell fraud, Laurel. And I think it was signed off by Russell and Marianne. The diner faded. The smell of frying bacon and stale coffee disappeared. In their place, a montage of my life played back in agonizing clarity. Me at 17, sitting at the kitchen table begging for help with college applications, only for my mother to say, "Laurel, we have to be practical, maybe a community college." Me, at 19, working 3 jobs, a barista, a tutor, a library assistant to cover tuition, while Caleb, who had dropped out, was living rent-free in a downtown apartment funded by a loan from our parents. The memory of my father, his face etched with a pained disappointment I'd always internalized as my own failure, saying, "Honey, we just can't bail you out like we do Caleb. He needs us more." Every time I'd asked for help for a car repair, for a down payment on a rental, for anything at all, I was met with that same strained look, that same speech about responsibility, about how they had to focus their resources on Caleb's potential. They hadn't been protecting him, they had been funding him. With my life, with my future. "It's not just the money," I whispered, the realization hitting me with the force of a physical blow. "It's everything, my entire life. Every job I hated, every apartment I couldn't afford, every single choice I thought I was making. It was all based on a lie." A cold, sharp anger unlike anything I'd ever felt began to replace the numbness. This wasn't just self-blame anymore. It was suspicion. What do I do? Diane was already dialing a number on her phone. "You request a formal audit. Our grandfather's estate was handled by Samuel Hart. He's old-school meticulous, and he hated your mother's spending habits. If anyone will get to the bottom of this, it's Sam." I agreed, my voice shaking. I felt a profound internal shift, the tectonic plates of my identity grinding against each other. I wasn't the girl who had less potential. I was the girl who had been robbed. We met Samuel Hart at his dusty wood-paneled office that afternoon. He was a man in his late 70s with eyes that had seen everything. He listened patiently as Diane laid out her suspicions. I just sat there clutching my grandfather's letters, the only proof I had that someone in that family had once valued me. Samuel retrieved my grandfather's files, thick with decades of paperwork. He spread the trust documents on his desk, his brow furrowing as he compared the logs Diane had brought with the original directive. The office was silent, save for the ticking of a grandfather clock in the corner. He spent nearly an hour cross-referencing, his breathing the only sound. Finally, he looked up, his gaze finding mine. He slowly closed the heavy file folder, his movements deliberate, his expression one of profound sorrow. He folded his hands, his face pale. He leaned forward and whispered, "Laurel, you're the victim of long-term financial misuse." Samuel Hart didn't just conduct a preliminary audit. He performed an autopsy on my stolen life. For the next 48 hours, while I stayed at a local motel, refusing to even speak to my parents, he and Diane dug. What they found was a systematic 25-year hemorrhage of my future. Samuel sat me down in his office, the desk covered in ledgers and bank statements that felt like artifacts from a stranger's life. "Laurel," he said, his voice grave, "this wasn't a mistake, this was a strategy." He showed me the withdrawals, starting small just after my grandfather's death and escalating. He pointed out my signature on documents I'd never seen authorizing transfers. "Forgeries," he stated, his finger tapping the paper. "And crude ones. They banked on you never finding out." The majority of my $2.5 million trust hadn't just vanished. It had been meticulously siphoned, reallocated, and absorbed into the very foundations of the Adams family identity. The paper trail told a story that made me sick. Tens of thousands funneled to pay off Caleb's mounting gambling debts to less than patient bookies. A six-figure injection to fund Caleb's creations. His failed custom motorcycle business that folded in less than a year. A massive withdrawal that perfectly matched the date my parents refinanced their house, the one they'd been in danger of losing. But it didn't stop at emergencies. It was the vacations, the trips to Europe I'd seen on Facebook, the ski trips to Aspen. It was Caleb's multiple expensive stints in rehab, which they'd always framed as a tragic family burden. It was cars, dinners, club memberships. It was their entire upper-middle-class life, a performance paid for by me. And the most damning part. The list of expenditures for Laurel Adams. It was blank. Not $1 for my college tuition. Not for the down payment on a reliable car. Not for the emergency root canal that cost me 2 months' rent. Not for housing. Not for emergencies. Not for anything. I felt a grief so profound it was physical. It settled in my chest like a block of ice. They hadn't just neglected me. They hadn't just preferred Caleb. They had actively, consciously, and repeatedly chosen to sacrifice my future to finance their present. They didn't just let me struggle. They ensured it. They built their house on the foundation of what was meant for me. My entire sense of self, my pride and my self-reliance, shattered. It wasn't resilience. It was a role I was forced to play because my part of the script had been given to someone else. Diane, sitting beside me, took my hand. Her grip was like iron. "You need to understand," she said softly. "This is who they've always been." She told me stories from their childhood. How Marianne, terrified of the poverty they grew up in, had always coddled Caleb, her golden boy, swearing he would never want for anything. How she expected Diane and later me to raise herself. She reminded me of my father, Russell, a man who truly believed that sons needed second chances to build their legacies, while daughters needed tough love to become strong. "He thinks he's teaching you resilience, Laurel," Diane said, her voice laced with anger. "He's just using his father's words to justify your mother's theft." A fury clean and cold began to burn through the grief. This wasn't just a personal failure on their part. It was a cultural double standard I had been suffocating under my whole life, one I had always mistaken for my own inadequacy. I wasn't less than. I was a girl. And in my family, that meant I was the resource, not the recipient. In our small town, that was everything. Reputations are the only currency that matters. My mother, Marianne, sits on 3 different charity boards, the picture of community grace and selflessness. My father, Russell, leads the local community business association, hailed as a man of integrity. Their entire social standing was a lie funded by my stolen trust. The exposure wouldn't just embarrass them, it would utterly ruin them. The power for the first time in my life was in my hands. I could go public. I could file a lawsuit, have them charged. I could destroy them just as they had quietly, systematically destroyed my chances. The thought was tempting, a dark, sweet pull toward vengeance. But what would that leave me with, rubble numb? I didn't want to destroy them. I wanted them to see me. I wanted them to say it. I wanted them to account for it. I decided then. This wouldn't be fought with lawyers in public, not yet. It would be fought in a room with the truth. I looked at Samuel. "I want a meeting, a family meeting." He nodded, understanding immediately. "Here, my office." "Yes," I said, the cold fury solidifying into resolve. "I want every single one of them there. Russell, Marianne, and Caleb. They are going to sit in a room and look at what they did." Samuel picked up his phone to begin scheduling what he was already calling the official reckoning. I wanted them to see the paper trail. I wanted them to see the numbers. But most of all, I wanted them to look at me, Laurel, the girl who had less potential, and finally tell me the truth. The meeting was scheduled for 2 p.m. on Friday in Samuel Hart's largest conference room. It felt less like a family gathering and more like a deposition. Neutral territory. Formal. Clinical. Samuel had the full audit printed and bound into 4 separate copies, resting on the polished mahogany table like unexploded bombs. I arrived half an hour early, my heart a trapped bird against my ribs. The old habit was strong, a physical pull to shrink, to apologize, to make myself small so everyone else could be comfortable. It was the role I'd always played. But as I stood at the window looking down at the manicured lawn of Samuel's firm, a new cold resolve settled over me. This wasn't about their comfort. It was about my life. When Aunt Diane arrived, she didn't say a word. She just walked over and stood beside me, a silent, solid presence. My emotional anchor. She was the only family I had in that room. The rest of them arrived together, a united front of denial. My father Russell entered first, his eyes immediately finding the carpet, a man already bracing for impact. My mother Marianne followed, her spine rigid, her chin high, a mask of defensive indignation firmly in place. She looked at me not with remorse, but with annoyance, as if I were a stain on her reputation. And then came Caleb. My brother, the center of their universe, sauntered in, flashing a pained, charming smile. "Hey, Laurie," he said, his voice wheedling. "Jesus, isn't this a little much, Sam? What's this really about? Are you overreacting?" He was trying to charm the room, to play his usual card of concerned, misunderstood son. It was clear they'd arrived assuming this was about a simple misunderstanding, a financial quibble that I, the overly sensitive daughter, had blown out of proportion. They were here to pat me on the head, clear up the confusion, and get back to their lives. Samuel Hart, a man who had no patience for theatrics, waited until they were seated. "There is no misunderstanding," he said, his voice cutting through Caleb's charm. He slid the bound copies of the audit summary across the table, one for each of them. "This," he said, "is a reckoning." My mother immediately tried to interrupt. "Now, Samuel, I hardly think this is necessary." "You will be silent, Marianne." Samuel snapped, his authority absolute. "You will listen. For the first time, you will all listen." I watched them. I watched as the performance began to unravel. My father's hands, resting on the table, began to tremble as he turned the first page. My mother, defiant, refused to open hers, staring a hole in the wall just over Samuel's shoulder. Caleb, for his part, actually laughed, a short, nervous bark. "This is insane. This is a joke." "Page 4, Caleb," Samuel said, "details the first payoff of your gambling debts authorized by your father, withdrawn from Laurel's trust." Caleb's smile vanished. The color drained from his face. I watched my mother. As Samuel continued detailing the forged signatures, the refinancing of their house, the vacations, a horrifying realization dawned on me. She wasn't afraid of the truth. She wasn't feeling guilt. She was feeling humiliation. She was afraid of Samuel. She was afraid of Diane. She was afraid of this getting out of her charity boards, finding out. Her primary emotion was not remorse. It was social terror. That, more than the theft itself, broke what was left of my heart. My father was the first to crumble. When Samuel reached the section on the failed business venture, Russell let out a choked sound. "The stress," he whispered, his eyes squeezing shut. "The financial stress was... I didn't know what to do." He looked at me, his gaze pleading. It was Caleb. He needed us." "Don't you put this on me," Caleb yelled, slamming his hand on the table. "I never asked you to do this. I didn't even know where the money was coming from. The receipts for the rehab clinic in Utah signed by you are on page 12. Diane said, her voice quiet and lethal. Caleb went silent, his face collapsing in on itself. He denied everything until the evidence, the receipts, the transfers, the dates piled up so high he was buried beneath them. The room was boiling. Accusations flew, Russell blaming Caleb's instability, Caleb blaming their pressure, and Marianne sitting in a state of vibrating silent rage. I had just sat there watching them tear each other apart over the ruins of my life. And then the room went quiet, all of them looking at me. The person they had forgotten was at the center of it all. Samuel had stopped talking. The audit was finished. It was my turn. My voice came out low, shaking but clear. "You're all talking about the money," I said. "You're talking about stress and rehab and appearances, but you're missing the point." I looked at each of them. At Caleb, the golden boy I'd had to parent. At my father, the man whose approval I'd craved. at my mother, the woman whose attention I'd died for. For 28 years, I thought I was the problem. I thought I was less. Not as smart, not as charming, not as worthy of help. You let me believe it. You encouraged me to believe it. The tears I'd been holding back finally came hot and furious. You didn't just neglect me, you actively manipulated me. You made me feel grateful for the scraps while you feasted on my future. You stole my opportunities, you stole my confidence, you stole my entire sense of self. I leaned forward, the words tearing out of me. You didn't just steal money, you stole choices. The silence that followed was absolute, heavier than any I'd ever experienced. My words hung in the air, irrevocable. My mother looked devastated, but I knew it was her reputation, not her conscience, that was wounded. My father was openly weeping. Caleb just stared at the table, defeated. Samuel Hart, his face impassive, looked away from my family and turned to me. His voice was gentle. Laurel, what do you want to do next? I lifted my eyes, meeting his. My body was trembling, but my gaze was firm. I had a choice. The room was silent, holding its breath. Samuel's question, "What do you want to do next?" was the pivot point. This was it. This was the moment my entire life had been leading to, the one where I could either crumble back into the person they'd made me or stand up as the person I was meant to be. I saw the options flash before me, the righteous, fiery path of public humiliation, lawsuits, and complete destruction. Vengeance. And then I saw another path. It was harder, quieter, and it wasn't about them. It was about me. I wanted accountability, not annihilation. I wanted to rebuild, not just to burn what was left. I took a deep breath, the first one that felt like it reached my lungs, and I met my father's tear-filled eyes. I looked at Caleb, who was staring at his hands. I looked at my mother, who was vibrating with pure, unadulterated fury. First, I said, my voice cutting through the silence, and I was proud that it didn't shake. Samuel, I want whatever is left of my trust, every remaining cent, transferred into a new account under my sole control, effective immediately. Samuel nodded, already pulling a form from his desk. Consider it done. Second, I continued, turning back to my family. I want a legally binding repayment plan. Samuel will draft it. It will cover what I am owed, and it will be signed by all three of you. My father flinched. Caleb looked like he was going to be sick. And third, I said, the words tasting strange and powerful, if any of you, and here I looked directly at my mother, want to have any kind of relationship with me ever again, it will be on my terms. That means mandatory family counseling, all of us, together, so we can actually talk about what happened here, not just the money. That was what finally broke my mother. Mary Ann, who had been a statue of rigid denial, exploded. Ruin! She shrieked, her voice cracking. You want to ruin us! After everything we've done, after the stress we've been under, you would tear this family apart for money. You are ungrateful, Laurel. You are destroying this family. The accusation hung in the air, thick and poisonous. It was the card she had always played, the one that always worked. I was the difficult one. I was the cold one. I was the problem. But it didn't work. Not anymore. I just looked at her, the woman who had sacrificed me on the altar of her own fear, and I felt nothing. Just a vast, cold calm. The family, I said, my voice quiet but carrying over her ragged breathing, was ruined long before today. You broke it. You broke it every time you lied, every time you stole from me to give to him, every time you chose your reputation over your daughter. I'm not trying to destroy it. I'm trying to rebuild what you broke. My words hit the room like a physical force. Caleb, who had been rocking slightly in his chair, finally broke down. Not with charm, not with excuses, but with a raw, ugly sob that tore out of him. She's right, he whispered, tears streaming down his face. She's right. I always knew. I knew it wasn't fair, Laurel, I swear I did. I saw how they treated you. But I was weak. I needed them. I needed the money, and I knew if I said anything, if I defended you, they'd cut me off. I was a coward. It was the first honest thing he'd ever said to me. Then my father, Russell, just collapsed. He folded in on himself, his head in his hands, his whole body shaking. "I'm so sorry, Laurel." He wept, the words muffled. "I'm so sorry. I was afraid. I was so afraid of losing her." He gestured miserably toward my mother. "I was afraid of losing her approval. I let her. I let her make the decisions. I told myself it was for the best that you were strong. But I was just a coward." This was it. The truth. All of it. The weakness, the fear, the jealousy. But my mother couldn't take it. To see her husband and her golden son admit the truth, to have her entire world of careful denial shatter in a single moment, was too much. With a sound of pure anguish, Marianne shoved her chair back, a screech of wood on wood, and fled the room. She didn't just walk out. She ran as if the room were on fire. The old Laurel, the little girl, would have run after her, would have apologized, would have fixed it. I stayed in my seat. I watched her go, and I didn't move. Beside me, I felt a hand on my arm. "Aunt Diane." She leaned in, her voice a low, fierce whisper in my ear. "You stood up, Laurel. Your grandfather would be so proud." Samuel, ever the professional, used the silence to slide the newly prepared legal transfer documents across the table. "If you'll just sign here, Laurel." I picked up the heavy pen. I looked at the line where my name was supposed to go. I thought of the 28 years of struggling, of blaming myself, of feeling small. I put the pen to the paper. My hand didn't shake. I had just set the pen down when the conference room door opened again. It was Marianne. She stood in the doorway, her armor gone. Her face was blotchy, her makeup ruined. She was crying. Not the tears of anger or manipulation I had seen before, but the desperate, lost tears of a child. It was the first time in my life I had ever seen her truly cry. She looked at me, her gaze stripped of all its pride, all its defense. Her voice was small, almost unrecognizable, a raw whisper. "I don't know how to fix this." In a town as small as ours, secrets don't stay buried. They just seep into the groundwater. After that day in Samuel's office, the misunderstanding became the only thing anyone could talk about, even if they didn't have the details. There was no public lawsuit, no arrests, but the consequences were immediate. The Adams family, a pillar of the community, suddenly looked unstable. The rumors were a wildfire. Marianne, my mother, quietly resigned from all 3 of her charity boards, citing personal health reasons. The humiliation she'd feared had arrived not with a bang, but with a series of quiet, concerned whispers she couldn't control. My father, Russell, did the same, quitting the community business club he had led for a decade. He was ashamed, and for the first time it wasn't a performance. The fall from grace for them was total. The biggest shock, however, came from Caleb. 2 days after the meeting, I got a call from a number I didn't recognize. It was a clinic. Caleb had checked himself into a long-term rehab facility, not for the usual drug or alcohol binge, but for what he was calling a complete behavioral and moral overhaul. He'd told the intake nurse he was there to finally take responsibility. I hung up the phone and felt something I hadn't expected, a sharp, conflicted pang of compassion. He was my brother. He was weak and jealous and complicit in my ruin, but he was also a victim of their expectations in his own way. He was the golden boy, but the pedestal was also a prison. I wasn't ready to forgive him, but the white-hot anger I'd felt had cooled to a dull, complicated ache. I didn't wait around. I took the remaining funds, now legally and solely mine, and I left my 2-job, paycheck-to-paycheck life in Portland. The first thing I did wasn't extravagant. I bought a modest 2-bedroom condo on the outskirts of town near the river. It was the first place I'd ever lived that I didn't have to share with roommates, the first set of keys that felt like they were mine. I bought furniture that wasn't from a thrift store. I sat on my new couch in the quiet and just breathed. The second thing I did was find a therapist, someone who specialized in family trauma and complex grief. I had to process the fact that the life I'd grieved for not having was a life I was supposed to have had all along. I was grieving the theft, yes, but I was also grieving the person I'd been forced to become, the perpetually strong one, the one who never needed anything. A week after I'd moved in, my father called. He didn't ask to be forgiven. He didn't make excuses. He just asked, his voice rough, "Laurel, could I come and see your new home? I'd like to bring you a housewarming gift." I said yes. He arrived with a simple potted oak sapling, his hands trembling slightly as he gave it to me. We sat on my new couch and he just talked. He apologized sincerely for his weakness, for his cowardice, for failing me. "I always knew you were the strong one," he said, his eyes on the floor. "You were so capable, so much like your grandfather. You just seemed like you didn't need us. Not like Caleb did." He looked at me, then his eyes pleading for me to understand. "I used it as an excuse," he admitted, his voice breaking. "It was easier to believe you didn't need help than to stand up to your mother and admit we were failing you." I looked at the little tree, a symbol of a strength I'd never asked for. "Strength shouldn't be a punishment, Dad," I said, my voice soft. "It shouldn't mean I deserved less." He just nodded, the tears rolling down his face, and for the first time we just sat in a difficult, honest silence. A few days later, a letter arrived, postmarked from Caleb's rehab facility. It was 12 pages long, written in his messy, looping script. It wasn't the charming, manipulative Caleb I knew. It was raw. He acknowledged everything, the jealousy he'd felt his whole life, the guilt he'd buried, the way he'd used my parents' favoritism as a shield. He didn't ask for forgiveness. He said he didn't deserve it. He just asked if someday we could start a slow rebuild from scratch on honest ground. I folded the letter and put it in a drawer. I wasn't ready, but I didn't throw it away. Through all of this, there was one person I hadn't heard from: my mother. While my father and brother were taking tentative, painful steps toward accountability, Marianne remained utterly silent. Weeks went by. The silence from her was louder than the shouting in Samuel's office. It was a cold, familiar absence, the one I'd lived with my whole life. I had accepted it. I had to. Then one Tuesday afternoon, my phone rang. It was her number. I stared at it, my heart kicking against my ribs. I let it ring twice, then answered. "Hello?" There was a long pause, just the sound of a shaky, indrawn breath. Then a voice I almost didn't recognize. It was small. It was thin. It was stripped of all its polish, all its authority. It was just a voice. "Laurel, can we talk, please?" I agreed to meet her. Not at her house, which had been bought with my money. Not at my new condo, which was a sanctuary she hadn't earned the right to enter. I chose a quiet riverside park, a neutral space equidistant from our two very different lives. I saw her before she saw me. She was sitting on a bench staring at the water, and for a moment, I didn't recognize her. The polished, perfectly coiffed, intimidating woman who had dominated my childhood was gone. The woman on the bench looked older, smaller, and profoundly shaken. She was wearing simple clothes, no jewelry, and her hair was pulled back without care. Her armor was gone. When she saw me approaching, she stood, her hands twisting in front of her. There was no defense left in her eyes, just a hollow, bottomless fear. We didn't exchange pleasantries. We just stood there, the sound of the river rushing past. She spoke first, her voice a reedy whisper, the one I'd heard on the phone. I used to watch my mother count pennies," she said, her gaze fixed on the rapids. "I'd watch her water down the milk, pretending it was a game. I'd watch her cry when the rent was due. I swore, Laurel, I swore on my life that my son would never know that feeling, that he would never ever struggle for anything." She turned to me, her eyes desperate. "Caleb, he was so much like me, so sensitive, so easily broken. I saw all my own fears in him." "And what did you see in me?" I asked, my voice flat. The question hung in the air, sharp and dangerous. She flinched, but she answered. "I saw your grandfather," she whispered. "I saw someone who was resilient, someone who was strong. You seemed like you could survive anything. Every time you fell, you got back up all by yourself. I I told myself that was a gift. I told myself I was letting you be strong. You didn't let me be strong, Mom. I said the word tasting like ash. You forced me to be. There was no other option. I know, she said, the tears finally coming. I know. I was so afraid of showing favoritism, of being called out on it, that I just did it anyway, but in secret. I convinced myself it was just moving money around, that it was all family money. I told myself you'd be fine, that you'd land on your feet. It started small, just to cover Caleb's debts, and then it just became how we lived. It wasn't malice, Laurel, she pleaded, taking a step toward me. It was fear. I was just so afraid. This was it. The rawest, most honest, most pathetic I had ever seen my mother. She wasn't the monster who had plotted my ruin. She was just a weak, terrified woman who had made 1,000 selfish choices, one after another, until it had become a landslide. I took a deep breath. I felt the familiar pull to comfort her, to make it okay. It was the role I had played for 28 years. I resisted it. I hear you, I said, and she looked up, surprised by the cold calm in my voice. I hear your reasons, but they don't change what you did. I saw her brace for the final blow, for the "I hate you," for the "I'll never speak to you again." But I didn't want vengeance. I wanted a future. I'm not going to forgive you, I said. Not now. I don't know if I ever can, not completely. Forgiveness it's a long way from here. She deflated, but I wasn't finished. But I will. I paused, searching for the right word. I will try to move forward. With you. But on my terms. She nodded, desperate. Anything. Laurel, anything. Then these are the boundaries, I said, counting them out as clearly as Samuel Hart had read the audit. 1. No more secrecy about anything. Not about money, not about Caleb, not about your feelings. The truth or nothing. 2. No more favoritism. Caleb is an adult. His recovery is his. My life is mine. You are not his safety net anymore. And 3. You will never, ever use your vulnerability as a weapon again. Your fear is not an excuse to hurt me. I expected her to argue. I expected her to fight for a loophole. Instead, she just broke. A sound of pure, unadulterated grief left her, and she doubled over, sobbing. I agree, she choked out. I agree. And then she did something she hadn't done since I was a small child. She reached for me. It was hesitant, a trembling, uncertain gesture. She put her arms around me, and it wasn't the stiff, polite hug of her past. She was clinging to me. I stood rigid for a moment, and then I felt her tremble. A deep, racking shudder, as if the very bones of her were breaking apart and trying to reform. And I, against my own will, put my arms around her. I held my mother as she wept by the river, and I felt the first tiny, painful spark of something that wasn't anger. It wasn't forgiveness, but it felt like a beginning. That night, for the first time in years, I opened my journal. I wrote about the river and about my mother's tears. I wrote about how boundaries felt stronger than anger. I found myself thinking about my grandfather, the man whose legacy had started all this. I remembered something Aunt Diane had told me. He always preached an American value he'd learned in the war and built his business on. I wrote it down. Family isn't about being perfect. It's about choosing to be better. I closed the book, feeling a quiet settle over me. I wasn't fixed. We weren't fixed. But we were finally on honest ground. I was getting ready for bed when my phone buzzed on the nightstand. A new text message from an unknown number. I opened it. Laurel, it's me, Caleb. I'm out, I'm clean, and I'm ready to face you. And the truth. The rehab facility was a stark, quiet place, smelling of disinfectant and brewed coffee. It was family day. I saw Caleb before he saw me. He was standing alone by a window, thinner, with a clarity in his eyes I'd never seen before. The slick, charming veneer he'd worn his whole life had been scrubbed off. He looked raw, and for the first time he looked older than me. When he finally turned, his gaze was direct. There was no wheedling, no manipulation, just a deep, profound shame. "Laurel," he said, his voice quiet. We sat on a pair of hard plastic chairs, the buzz of group therapy sessions humming in the background. He didn't make excuses. He apologized. He owned all of it. He spoke of his lifelong toxic envy of my strength, the guilt he felt every time our parents bailed him out while I struggled, and the suffocating dependence he'd had on their approval, which had made him a willing participant in the lie. "I wasn't just a coward, Lori," he said, his eyes finally meeting mine, wet with tears he didn't try to hide. "I was a thief just like them. I let them sacrifice you so I didn't have to grow up. I'm so sorry." I looked at my brother, this broken, rebuilding man, and I felt the last of the ice around my heart crack. I forgave him. I said the words out loud, and I meant them. Not for him, not entirely. I did it for me. I did it so I could put down the weight of that one last heavy stone. I was done being angry. I was ready to be free. The counseling sessions were brutal. The three of us, my mother, my father, and I, sitting in a sterile office learning how to speak a language we'd never known: honesty. The first few meetings were a minefield of defensive half-truths and long, painful silences. My mother tried to fall back on her fear. My father tried to use his shame as a shield, but our therapist, a no-nonsense woman, wouldn't let them, and I, armed with my new boundaries, wouldn't either. Slowly, painstakingly, we started to rebuild. It wasn't a house we were building, but a raft just strong enough to hold us floating on a very turbulent sea. We established a new tradition, a weekly family dinner. Not the stiff, formal performances of my childhood. These were at my condo. They were simple. Sometimes we ordered pizza. Sometimes my father grilled. They were warm. They were imperfect. There were still silences, but they were no longer cold. They were just spaces where we were learning to breathe. The repayment plan began. The first check from my parents was small, but it came on time. It was a tangible sign of their commitment. But I quickly realized the money had become the least important part of the equation. The real reclamation wasn't in the dollars being returned. It was in the accountability finally being taken. It was in hearing my mother ask, "Laurel, is this okay with you?" It was in my father calling just to see how my day was without any agenda. It was in Caleb, who was now living in a sober living house and working his first ever menial job, sending me $20 from his paycheck with a note that just said, "For the fund." I was learning that reclamation wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about burning everything to the ground. It was about truth. It was about setting boundaries so firm they became foundations. It was about rebuilding on something real, even if it was small, even if it was scarred. I thought about my grandfather, a man I barely knew, but whose legacy had in its own strange way saved me. His resilience, his belief in community, his ironclad conviction that freedom was something you earned through clarity and hard work. He'd left me money, yes, but he'd also left me a fight I hadn't known I was in. And in winning it, I'd found the very resilience he valued. Our family isn't magically healed. We are not fixed. There's a scar that runs right through the center of us, a reminder of the trust that was broken. But we are honest. For the first time in our lives, we are truly painfully honest. And I am no longer on the margins of my own story. I am not the quiet, strong one left to fend for herself. I am standing at the absolute center of my life, holding the pen, writing my own script. I went back to the Riverside Park, my park. I sat on the bench where my mother had confessed her fears, and I opened my journal. I felt a sense of peace I'd never known, not the thrill of victory, but the quiet, deep calm of resolution. I wrote, "I used to think my family broke me, but the truth is, they shaped me, and now I get to shape us back." I closed the book, the sun warm on my face. Across the park at a picnic table, I saw them waiting. My father fumbling with a bag of charcoal, my mother tentatively setting out paper plates. and Caleb standing beside her just talking. They looked up as I approached. I saw their faces a mix of hesitation and hope, and a quiet readiness. I smiled. It wasn't a perfect smile, but it was a real one. And I started walking toward them. It felt after all this time like a beginning, not an ending. And so Laurel closed the ledger, not just on her family's debt, but on a lifetime of pain, choosing to build a new future on the foundations of truth. What did you think of Laurel's choice? Could you have forgiven them? Let us know in the comments. We read every single comment of your thoughts. If you enjoyed this story, please subscribe. Thank you for listening. This has been a story from Radiance. We'll see you next time.